Jacksonville. The child was born who couldn't sit still. 86 years later with no regret. You know that man can't sit still yet. The Great Depression couldn't get him down. He worked for his dad's store in town, collecting money in small amounts for poor whites and blacks in their furniture accounts. Stetson Kennedy wants us all to be free. Stetson Kennedy wants us all to be free. As he'd collect, he'd talk to folks. He'd hear legends, tales, songs, and jokes. Now this fine treasure he'd record and write. He was colorblind, didn't see black and white. Writer's project for the WPA. Zora Neale Hurston, he earned his pay. Crackers and blacks, they talk for hours. It was a barefoot history of this land of flowers.
The week that was on the 23rd of November 2016 from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. Incidentally, we did an episode on the debate in the UK between the Conservative or Tory Party candidate Boris Johnson and the Labour Party candidate Jeremy Corbyn. It's an interesting debate, a little different from the debate that you heard on Wednesday night out of Atlanta, Georgia, in that it was an hour. And basically what happened there was the Prime Minister Johnson got in Brexit as many times as he possibly could, because it was his belief that many of the people watching the debate would not watch it for 50 minutes or 60 minutes or whatever. Thus, he got it in. I didn't count them, but you can go there probably 20 times. No matter what the question was, if it was the National Health Service or whatever, he got in Brexit. And at the same time, the Conservative Party's communications Twitter feed, they rebranded it into UK Fact Check or something to that effect. Now, this is the same type of activity that we saw in the 2016 election campaign in the U.S. And also now the same organization that worked with the notorious Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, was involved in the Leave Remain election to turn the British election, which is a very short period. Their election is on the 12th or the 13th of December this year, 2019. Very, very quick turnaround. But on the Leave campaign, using an American kind of campaign, which is not based on issues, but based on alternative facts. In other words, facts that do not have any type of grounding in reality. Thus, this was the fact checker that continually told people that were on Twitter that the Prime Minister Johnson was winning every round. Now, there was a instant poll on Twitter by ITV, and it actually had Jeremy Corbyn up, 78 to 23 for Boris Johnson. Now, this was the instant one. You usually have these instant polls. There was another instant poll, I think YouGov did it, and it was almost a dead heat between the Prime Minister Johnson and the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn. But I think it was about 3 points or so. It was in the, I didn't look at the margin of error. It didn't matter that much. But what tactics do matter, and believe it or not, it's like Wrigley's. I just enjoy that he had these famous events. Anyway, there's a report of so-called Russian interference in the UK election. They evidently were equal opportunity types, and that report has not been made public. Johnson is sitting on it, so that makes me feel that some types of interference were there. Now, whether it's from the Russian Federation or not, that's one of the big problems with cyber type of crimes, keepers. Recall a few years ago they had the Democratic Republic of Korea or North Korea supposedly attacking Sony Pictures, but they really never had any evidence because supposedly the feed came through China. But if you have, I remember we had a situation where we were using some ISP in China. Once you're into the internet, you can literally use data centers anywhere in the world. But we found out that this supposed data center we were using, that this material was stored on, was not owned by the people that we were dealing with. They were, of course, cheap. They could afford to be cheap. They did not own the data center. So thus you can disguise your so-called tracts, and very, very difficult to tell who is doing what. Period. So when you hear, well, the Russian Federation did this, and of course in the Ukrainian hearings before the Congress this last week, we heard all about all kinds of things, quid pro quo, and who did this, and this idea of perhaps Ukraine. Well, Ukraine is one of these asshole nations, and I apologize to any Ukrainians out there, but it is a minor nation in the scheme of things that had just emerged or was emerging from a civil war, or a war, however you want to call it. And the resources to interfere in a U.S. election was beyond the pale of logic. They would have absolutely no reason to do it. But your problem here is you have these internal interferences in the election, particularly on social media. Thus, you had in the Philippines and in India. In India, they used WhatsApp to confuse people. So people that spend a lot of time on social media, you have WhatsApp comes in here. That's owned by Facebook. Facebook tends to be more popular than Twitter. Twitter is a little different kind of situation, but what does happen in terms of DJ Trump and company, he has his Twitter feed, and whatever he tweets is broadcast by the monopoly media, and it's put on Facebook, and thousands of people broadcast the tweet. So this was a whole idea behind the Conservative Party. When they were called out on it, and one of their officials said, well, so what? Well, this is an interesting type of, I won't say excuse, but this is an interesting position. This is sort of like one of the chief strategies for DJ Trump. Well, we have alternative facts. So in other words, this is Goebbels' big lie. You tell the big lie. At that time they did, historians found it was just a lie. But now, instead of just calling this a lie, a falsehood, or whatever you want to call it, it is turned into what happens, or S happens, or something of that nature. In other words, the Conservative Party did not take a responsibility for it, did not apologize to the people, and the Twitter authorities caught it, but they did not sanction them. They could have sanctioned them in terms of taking down their Twitter account if they wished for a number of days, etc. People have been vanished from social media, whether it be YouTube, particularly Facebook, for doing things, presenting information that was not factual, or they allege that was not factual, or information that was inflammatory. We had a lot of people there. Jones, of course, is in a lot of litigation right now on the Facebook episode, and a lot of other accounts were closed, but most of these accounts that actually produced a lot of money are still there. The minister, Louis Farrakhan, out of Chicago, the head of Nation of Islam, he was taken off of Facebook and some of the YouTube situation there. So in other words, you have to look at the political content of what is going on. So this whole issue of who is doing what in the political sphere, the idea of some of the people that testified this week at the hearings said that the Russian Federation planned to interfere in 2020. Well, we have no evidence of that at this point, but be very, very careful about who is doing the interfering. There's a lot of interference within the U.S. by various operatives, particularly those that work around the Republican Party. That is part of their DNA. The right wing has always trafficked in troops, and that has been a constant situation. In other words, the big lie has always been part of their portfolio, and they will present something. Now, as fact, doesn't really matter. You'll have the Trump people saying, well, DJ Trump hollering as loud as he could, there was no quid pro quo. But when people look at his M.O., he normally does that. In other words, it's just like a gangster in New York. You don't have to say what, you just cover the subject, and the people get what we used to in grade school call a context clue. So in other words, if I speak a sentence, you will pick up on the meaning of what I say if I over and over again. So that was some of the testimony that came out from Sutherland out of Portland, Oregon, the hotel owner. He was talking about it was his common knowledge, and one other person also, a few of them brought it up there, that around the White House, various people, including Pompeo and the Mike Pence, the God boy, they all knew about it because it was floating all around the place. The question we have at this, Mike, why in the hell did DJ Trump and company do this in the first place? There was no reason to invite the put a condition, I should say, on the invitation of Zelensky to appear at the White House and get the aid. He got the aid, and I think I don't remember if he did his appearance at the, well, I don't think he did, but anyway, that doesn't really matter as much. As far as the Hunter Biden and his dodgy activity, he could have just asked his flunky at the Justice Department Barr to do an investigation. And just by simply doing an investigation, as is the senator from South Carolina, Graham is supposedly doing before his Senate committee, when he first said, but no, we in the Senate are not going to do any of these investigations. Well, the reason to do the investigation, any DA knows this, that if you put out there someone is under investigation, people immediately suspect something is going on. And we'll talk about from the Times of this investigation that Barr conducted of the FBI as to what they were doing in terms of this so-called Russian investigation and related to the Trump campaign. Now, the leaked situation is, and we'll get to exactly what it is, said, well, where they found some minor character may have changed something, some FBI agent type, but none of the leadership, quote-unquote, the FBI bosses, big shots, or what you want to call them, committed any crimes. But the idea of keeping this out in the public specter, DJ Trump evidently was on Fox and Friends, and was telling all his friends that this is going to be really, really big, like a carnival barker. So this is the type of campaign style they have imported, or exported actually, to the UK, a carnival barker mentality. This is something that's been used in this country for a very long time, since Karl Rove, and then we had, I forget his name now, he's dead anyway, a fellow out of South Carolina there, and the famous when Professor Dukakis was running out of the Commonwealth. He was the governor at the time. He's still a professor of political science at is it Northwestern? He's at Northeastern, excuse me, or is it Boston College? Anyway, the famous William Horton ads. Of course, they called him Willie Horton. And I know Reverend Horton and the family never called William Willie. But this was this whole scenario where Willie Horton gets out of prison, etc., and commits these crimes. This was a furlough program. But that was a kind of acts they put out. Now, they did not have the internet at that time. So it was a different situation there, different climate within the country. Now was a country polarized as it is today. But it's easily done when you have the conspiracy theories started it all. And there's several different branches of conspiracy theories. I've been reading a book here on the European working class. We're still here. This is by Jennifer Silver. Anyway, very good book on why these things happen and how these people are convinced to either not vote or to vote. Some of them are following conspiracy theories, others are following white supremacists, etc. And they're all living, this particular thing is set in Western Pennsylvania. People that have relatives, whatever, on opioids, as they call it, in the opioid epidemic. Well, these are some of the things that play in here. You recall the whole saga of President Obama and his birth certificate. It was to legitimize Obama presidency. Well, when that couldn't happen, they went to college transcripts and various other things. But these were things that people that followed that type of conspiracy situation either ended up voting for DJ Trump or did not vote at all. And also you had an element coming out of there within the African American community where they said, well, what did President Obama do for us? A segment of those people around there, some phony nationalist types, were pushing that particular songbook. So you had all kinds of characters there, and then of course you had the other characters that have all these medical theories out there, the anti-vaccine people, the types of people are looking for the miracle cure at the stream. If you buy this particular water from the stream or whatever, or some vitamin, whatever the situation is, that will cure whatever you have. And of course, obviously, they did not have any type of laboratory trials, anything to support it, except for vitamin D. Now, I can recall that C was pushed at one time. C does have some things. C and B12, yes, they can do things for you also. But some of these other exotic things where you get into it is that various of these snake oil types have their own so-called formulas that have all kinds of herbs in them. People to be very careful for that. If you have children, make sure they get the measles vaccines, etc. Anyway, we didn't want to get off on all of that. But back to the debate, we'll get to that because we want to move along here. We'll move to Charlie Cook, and we'll get this one because we want to sort of, and then we'll go to, I believe, Mr. Coates. Anyway, writing in the New York Times. This is Amy Walter on the 21st of November, Wednesday night's DNC debate in Atlanta lacked the energy or the candidate engagement that many anticipated. In previous debates, the surging of front-running candidates found him or herself in the crosshairs of their opponents. The former Vice President of Biden was drilled by Kamala Harris over his record on busing. Elizabeth Warren on Medicare for All, period, going into Wednesday night. The mayor from South Bend, according to the Des Moines Register, a leader in Iowa, was expected to face the same level of scrutiny. Unfortunately, though, even when goaded by the moderators to confront him, the most serious opponents of the South Bend mayor pull their punches. However, this doesn't mean we didn't see any friction on the debate stage. There was a concerted effort by two African-American candidates, Senator Booker of New Jersey and Kamala Harris, of course, of California, to put a spotlight on the role of African-American voters in the Democratic Party and the general situation. And, of course, the role of the mayor from South Bend as to where he would be in this situation. So let me just, sorry about that. Oops. Get back to Amy here. Okay. So anyway, that was the debate. Got off to a slow start. Yeah, it was. I watched the entire debate. It didn't start until 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And on the last 2 days, marathon impeachment hearings, no doubt about that. A lot of people just didn't get there. And we have this one Democratic strategist wrote to me that night. Feels like debating to the student body president. This strategy has argued that the candidates were missing an opportunity to frame their contests more broadly. If I were advising one of them, well, I would may have told them after the question, most of them to take it back to Trump, to this corruption and what we are learning about it, to the imperative of getting him out of the White House and save the country, ditto, etc. Well, yes, this is what the example of what Johnson did, and no matter what the question was, Johnson only had Brexit on his mind. But three quarters of the way into the debate, saw sparks fly over the issue. The key question in the Democratic circles, which the Democratic candidates could not only win the African American vote, as illustrated by John Bell Williams in Louisiana, but could ensure that they turn out in 2020. No Democratic candidate since 1992 has won a nomination without winning a majority African American vote. Many claim Trump's victory on Hillary Clinton's failure to inspire and mobilize the people of color. That was one of those, and no doubt about that, but also suppression. It have a little more things going on there than just that particular situation. Just a minute. And he went on to say, I mean, this book, no one on this stage needs a focus group to hear from African American voters. African American voters are pissed off, and they're pissed off because the only time our issues seem to really pay attention by politicians is when people are looking for their vote. The focus group line was a so-called shot at the little mayor from South Bend, whose campaign has conducted interviews with African American voters in South Carolina. But like Harris, Booker didn't call out the little mayor Pete by his name. Instead, he went after the European candidates, what significant support amongst African Americans, which didn't mean anything. South Carolina has already decided. Biden was discounting the role that drug war had played on African Americans, brown Americans. Well, that doesn't really get you any brownie points now. That is more forgotten there. But anyway, Booker, we lost in Wisconsin because of massive diminution. A lot of reasons, no doubt about that. Massive diminution in the African American vote, particularly in Milwaukee. We need someone who can inspire, as Kamala Harris said, to inspire African Americans to the polls in record numbers. Biden responded by arguing that he was part of the Obama coalition. No one would debate with him like that. He said he was picked as vice president because of his long-standing relationship with the African American community. Well, there's no doubt about that, but that was a subtopic there. They took him because he was from Scranton, Pennsylvania. He was a quote-unquote European-style senator that Europeans would vote for because of his folksy situation. And he had support of, Carol Moseley Braun. Most people don't remember her. And then Kamala Harris, obviously, is senator herself. I said the first one, which the transcript shows, he did not say, Joe gets things wrong there. But anyway, because of this whole case here, this really didn't have as much to do with the, let me just finish it. So the question going fast forward is whether Booker or Harris will continue pressing the case that they made indirectly in debate, that voting for Biden are mere Pete risks alienating voters of color. Amy Klobuchar should be happy with that when they move to South Carolina. Now, in Iowa, different story there. That is where we've looked at several columns here that have mentioned Amy Klobuchar benefiting from this whole situation here. Let me get Charlie Cook here, and while we are here, this is Charlie Cook. He's writing on the 22nd of November with Saturday's gubernatorial runoff in Louisiana. The odd year elections are now in the record books. The Democrats captured governorship of Kentucky and re-election of governor of Louisiana. Well, coming up short in Mississippi mean anything? Are these results canaries in the proverbial coal mine or just random events? There are a couple of things that you can always be count on big elections. The winning side will invariably say that it's the most consequential election since the Athens fully developed democracy around 500 BC, and that outcome trends great things that the party in both short and long term. Similarly, the losing side can be expected to say, notwithstanding everything complimentary has been said before the election, both candidates and campaigns were terrible, and that wait a minute, hold. Factors prevented any meaning to be drawn. That ingenious factors to be drawn. Both Republican gubernatorial wins occurred in reliable Republican states, no doubt about that. They had Blevin made that the incumbent loss in Kentucky, despite the fact that he was a loyal Trump Republican, not because of it was a loyal the Republican, not because of it. In Louisiana, John Bell Edwards, and this was the maximum here, won because he ran on local issues, and no matter how many pictures of Nancy Pelosi, Ms. Ocasio there would help them in this particular situation. That was where they fell short, and then that was the end of the story right there. It did not work for them. It will not work in the future. So this is let me get to a little bit of Charlie's other stuff here. Both wins were occurred in reliable states. Won despite the fact that he's a Democrat, not because of it. No secret in Blevin was highly skilled at making enemies, both in his own party and outside there. And of course, John, a Democratic representative, Yarmish, so artfully put in the Washington Post, Matt Blevin is the kind of antithesis of any politician I've ever been around, in that he seems to get up every day and decide, well, who am I going to piss off today? Well, that sometimes does catch up with the governorship. They had alternated between parties since 1995. The last non-Southern Democrat to carry Bluegrass State was Adlai Stevenson. He ran against I Like Mike. I didn't know it was that bad. That's 1952. Democrats hold only one of the state 9 Senate and House seats, and 6 statewide elective offices on the ballot this year. Blevin was the only Republican to lose, and only by less than 5,000 votes. At the same time, in Louisiana, Edwards was the closest thing to a political unicorn as there is in today's politics. A pro-gun, pro-life West Point graduate Army Ranger getting elected as a Democrat. Prior to Edwards' election 4 years ago, Republicans had won 4 out of the 5 previous governor races in the state. Going into the election, Edwards was the only Democrat of the 7 statewide elected offices, and the only Democrat to win statewide this year as well. But he had a resume. Okay. Scandal plagued, well, we were getting the Vinner, yeah, he was toast before we got there. In Mississippi, the open governor's seat there. Now, this was Tate Reeves, 52-47 victory over Jim Hood. A fairly close contest there. When you consider, what is that, a 5-point? Yeah, 5-point victory. Wait a minute. 52-47, 5-point victory. Was not impressive in the state, but Trump carried by 18 points. Only 18 points where Republicans routinely run up big wins. So we are to disregard these outcomes, and to say that Beshear and Edwards didn't earn their wins is totally wrong. They had to be awfully good to have any chance of winning given where they were running. But we frequently see very capable and well-funded candidates in both parties run excellent campaigns in very tough states and districts, come up short. There are some undertones that even a Michael Phelps couldn't swim through. The same in politics. Sometimes being either lucky or good still isn't enough. You have to be both lucky and good. In 2018, Republicans did did well in small town and rural America, but they were quite fortunate in that the Senate battlegrounds were mostly red states where Trump was quite popular, helping the GOP score a net of 2 seats. Urban America was awful for Republicans, but it's nothing new. The change was in suburban America. Now, the suburbs were something that was cooked up after the war under racist apartheid housing policy. People were afforded an opportunity to move out of the central cities and to these newly created suburban areas. But we can, what can we take out of 2019? While it's true that state elections are not fought on the same terrain as federal races, we see an increased nationalization of American politics, and this is something the Trump people talked about. They wanted to nationalize the entire situation. There's no doubt about that. They were interested in a national campaign because that in itself was something that benefited DJ Trump. To nationalize that, use his popularity, particularly in these red states that happen to be rural at the outset. So Democrats gained control in November of the suburban Philadelphia County Council in as Buck, Chester, and Delaware counties. In the case of Delaware County, Republicans have held since the Civil War. Democrats picked up 2 seats of the 5-member council in 2017. They won the other 3 this year. A sweep in the county, a long-featured urban county. Now, that does mean that outside and around Philadelphia those are places that the Republicans used to reliably have their campaigns to go with the southeast part of the state. So this is, make sure I get Charlie finished up here. Now, one of the issues here, the only time Democrats have carried Louisiana, John F. Kennedy in 1960, a Catholic state. There have been 3 Southerners, Lyndon Johnson in 64, Jimmy Carter in 76, and Bill Clinton in both 1992 and 1996. 1986, 1968, sorry about that. George Wallace carried it. So that was kind of seeing where Louisiana has been. They, in fact, had a Klansman running down at one time. So this is the reality that the most convincing wins for Democrats were in low-level offices that didn't have the externing circumstances of Kentucky, Louisiana, and Virginia. Once red state that trended purple for the last decade is now starting to turn blue. Democrats captured both the House of Delegates and the Senate Commonwealth there, along with the governorship. So there were some things that were happening there. Let me go now to, we're going to say Colin Kopanek for later. I have an opinion article here. I think it's Michelle, no, wait a minute. Oh, let me switch here a second here and go to the New York Times. We'll look at a little bit of polling here. I don't have the Emerson poll out of Boston, but I do have a poll from the Iowa State University, and I will go for it. It was taken the 15th through 19th of November, people that will attend the Iowa caucuses. Now, the report contains the results of Civicus, I suppose how you pronounce that. This is 614 likely Democratic caucus attendees in Iowa. And let's see what else. Definitely, probably would attend, as the question they asked. It has a margin of error of 4.9 confidence. Let me get down here to the actual. Here's a rundown. How likely is that you will attend the caucus scheduled in February of 2020? Definitely will attend 73%, probably will attend 27%. If the caucus were held today, whom would you vote for? 26% picked Mayor Pete of South Bend, and 19% for the Elizabeth Warren from the Commonwealth, and 18% for Bernie Sanders. Basically a heap there. Joe Biden came in 1, 2, 3, 4 with 12%. Amy Klobuchar, she had 5% in this poll, and Andrew Yang had 4%. Tulsi Gabbard 2%. Kamala Harris also had 2%, and so did Tom Steyer. Then we had the 1%, Senator Booker, etc., Marianne Williams, those out there. So this is one of the polls where old Mayor Pete, what was he, got 7 points up on the others there. And there are various polls out here. Democratic caucus will held today. Which of the following candidates would be your second choice? Some strategists like to look at the second choice. 22% picked Elizabeth Warren. 17% Mayor Pete. 10% Bernie Sanders. 8% Amy Klobuchar, 7% Kamala Harris, a surprising 4% Tulsi Gabbard, and then Steyer, who spent millions of dollars, 3% to Booker, and a lot of 1%ers on down here. This is kind of interesting, second choice going there, and third choice, but we don't have rank voting in the caucus, but it could be. In some of those, under the rules, the person who comes in second could end up there, and it's a little different how they distribute the votes. We'll talk about that, of course, in later broadcasts. Now, how much time do you think that you can trust the government in Washington to do the right thing? Some of the time 85%, most of the time 15% there. Some people seem to follow what's going on in government and public affairs most of the time, or whether they are election going on or not. Most of the time 85% there. I won't get into too many of these answers, but a little bit of diving down. How often do you get your political views from a national TV network like CNN, ABC, NBC? Some 21% very often. 22% very often, sometimes. Now, this is a very important number here, 41% and 16% never. And they didn't mention Fox in this scenario. How often do you get your news from cable TV? This is where Fox came in, MSNBC, CNN. Very often 27%, often 22%, sometimes 29%. So you can see what the cable people are doing here, actually a little higher, so they're getting their news from cable. We got a lot of Fox News, CNN. I don't know about MSNBC types here. When it comes to politics, do you usually think of yourself as extremely liberal? 18%, 39% with liberal, slightly liberal 20%, middle of the road types 18%, slightly conservative 4%, and conservative 1%. Yeah. Where do you get your news from? Late night comedy shows, very often 10%, 9% often, and 44% sometimes, I guess. Will you attend the caucuses? Definitely, we already had that 73%, probably 27% of the Democrats, 80% there. Definitely 20%, probably. Independents 58%, and 42% definitely of females. 69% and males 78%, and probably 22% of the males, 31% of the females. 18 to 34-year-old Bernie Sanders people, 80% there. 35 to 49, 56%. The 50s to 64 is 85%, and 65 and older, 75%, and the probably 65 and over, 25%. The 35 to 49, 44%, and the 18 types to 34, 20%. So we definitely, Europeans 74%, non-Europeans 84%, 48%. This is in Iowa, probably 52% for non-Europeans. Non-college types, 69% of them probably will, 31% college grads, 76%, a high percentage there, and 24% probably. And the post-grads, are around there, 87% there. The ideological makeup there, extremely liberal, 92%, liberal, 75%, slightly liberal, 67%, moderates, 67% there. Those are the ones that will appear there. And the caucus vote definitely will, 73%, the Buttigieg people, 67%, Elizabeth Warren 80%, Bernie Sanders 75%, Biden 81%, he has the highest, and others 70%, onshore 60%, large degree of those people there. This is what you normally call the crosstabs, and we've already went through this, so we won't go through again, but we look at the age groups here very, very quickly. Mayor from South Bend has 21% of the 18 to 34s, 26% of 35 to 49s, and 50 to 64, 30% of those polls. 29% of 65 and older. Elizabeth Warren has 15% of that group, and 20% of the 35 to 49s. And let's see, where else is she? 18-year-olds, 26% there. Bernie Sanders in this setup, wait a minute here. He has 28% of the 18 there, and 22% of the 35 to 49, 16% of the 50s on, and only 10% of the 65-year-olds. Whereas with Joe Biden, who's 12% overall, he has 12% of the Democrats, 13% of the Independents. Male-female thing, he's getting 14% of the females, 10% of the males, 2% of the 18-year-olds, 12% of the 35 to 49s, 15% of the 50s to 64s, and 18 over. Amy Klobuchar, she's 5% of the Democrats, 5% of the Independents, a mix there, 5% of the females, 4% of the males in this poll, 12% of the 18-year-old types, 3% of the 35 to 49, and 7% of the 50 to 64%, and 65. A lot of work to be done there. Let me just look at one other thing, the college types. Won't spend a lot of time on that. Buttigieg is at 28% of the Europeans, 14% of the non-Europeans. Elizabeth Warren has 13%, and Bernie Sanders 13%, 18% from Bernie of the Europeans. Wait a minute, and 20% for Warren, 28% there, and Amy Klobuchar is low under 5 and 6% percentiles there. I'm gonna finish this up, but there's a lot of information here in this poll, and we pretty much, I think, got most of it down. Yeah, we did. We'll leave it where it is. Let me just check out time here. Okay. And we can go to John Bolton and his Twitter account. I suppose that's a good place to be. It's from the New York Times here. Bolton teases a city eager to hear from him is the title. Bolton, President Trump's former national security advisor. This is by Peter Baker. On the 22nd, Washington has waited to hear what he has to say. So when Bolton, the president's former advisor, pops up on Twitter on Friday morning with a teasing message, glad to be back on Twitter after 2 months. And he wrote for the backstory, stay tuned. He was finally going to describe his internal opposition to to the Ukrainian affair, and Giuliani saw a no-go. Only on the course of the day, Bolton posted a few more messages, not about Ukraine, but he said his Twitter account was seized by the White House. Anyone who knows Bolton should never have thought he would act spill on Twitter. He's a Yale-trained lawyer. He had made clear he is waiting for a court to tell him whether he has to testify or not. In a lawsuit filed by a deputy on, and this will be argued on the 10th of December. But he now has his Twitter account back, and of course we retweeted him across many of our. We have now liberated the Twitter account previously suppressed unfairly in the aftermath of my resignation as National Security Advisor, he wrote. 3 hours later, he added, speaking up, since resigning as National Security Advisor at the White House, refused to return access to my personal email Twitter account out of fear of what I may say, and to those who speculate, I went into hiding. I'm sorry to disappoint you. 2.5 hours after he continued in full disclosure, the White House never returned access to my Twitter account. Thank you to Twitter for standing by their community standards and rightfully returning control to Bolton. He had been on Twitter since 2010, and we now follow him. Anyway, this is basically that story. Let's see what else. Times, front page of their paper. Senate trial would be the biggest test of Trump's aggressive defense tactics, so they say. And of course, this report that's out, Bloomberg evidently has pumped $30 million into ads in 24 states. So in other words, he's moving in a hurry to play catch up with these candidates by putting that kind of money out there. Of course, people already nationally are familiar with Bloomberg. And I don't know if we'll have Michelle Bowie or not. We'll see here. Racism right before our eyes. Well, wait a minute, just a minute here. We may have to come back to that. Okay, Russian inquiry review is said to criticize the FBI but not rebuff claims of bias acts. Now, this is a post-Watchdog report which portrayed the pursuit of a wiretap on an ex-Trump advisor as sloppy, but it also debunks some of the accusations by Trump's allies of FBI wrongdoing. That's according to this. Now, again, this report won't be out till December. A highly anticipated report by the Department of Justice, as well as criticizes bureau leaders involved in the early stage. This is of the Trump-Russia investigation. The investigators for the inspector, Michael Horowitz, uncovered errors and omissions in documents relating to a wiretap of a former Trump advisor, Carter Page. Anyway, including a lawyer by the name of Kevin Kleinsmith, ordered an email that officials used to prepare to seek court approval to renew the wiretap. Get it right here. Referring to his finding about Kleinsmith to prosecute potential charges. Kleinsmith left the Russian investigation in February of 2018 after the Inspector General identified him as one of a handful of FBI officials who expressed an animus towards Trump in text messages and resigned 2 months later after the Inspector General's team interview. The Trump allies seized upon the message from Kleinsmith and his colleagues as proof of anti-Trump bias. His lawyer, of course, declined to say anything about this, and Horowitz reports to be made public. That's December the 9th. He will also sharply criticize as careless one of the FBI case agents in New York's handling of material and say that the Bureau and Department of Justice displayed poor coordination during the investigation. That's not unusual. At the same time, however, the report debunks a series of conspiracy theories, again, insinuations about the FBI that Trump and his allies have put out. Again, this is alternative universe here. The Times has not reviewed the draft, which contains other significant findings. In particular, Mr. Horowitz criticized the FBI's leadership for its handling of highly flawed Russian investigation. In some ways, he made no finding of political bias action by top officials. That is Mr. Comey, Mr. McCabe. He was the deputy who temporarily ran the bureau after Mr. Comey was fired. And Peter Sarzak, he's a former counterintelligence agent, top one there. Wiretaps of Page emerged as a political flashpoint in 2018, although it was a relatively narrow aspect of the sprawling inquiry. Let's see, Rosenstein here, Rod Rosenstein, former Deputy Attorney General who oversees the legal efforts related to 216, asked Horowitz to scrutinize the situation. That's how Horowitz got into this whole thing. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court first approved the wiretaps on Page, who had close ties to Russia. Page pled guilty. Incidentally, the paperwork associated with the renewal application contained information that should have been left out, vice versa. People briefed their email. The email Kleinsmith handled was a factor during the renewal process. Kleinsmith took an email from an official at another federal agency that contained several factual assertions. So we'll hear more about Kleinsmith. Referred findings to Mr. Kleinsmith went to John Durham, a prosecutor assigned by Barr, and also to re-examine the Russian case and its origins. The referral from Horowitz's team appears to, at least in part, be based upon the elevation of Durham's inquiry. Amongst the FBI officials removed by the Special Counsel Robert Mueller after Horowitz found texts expressing political animus, and Kleinsmith evidently worked on the Hillary Clinton investigation also. Other potential changes in the text. This is in the June 2018 report. Identified as attorney too. Kleinsmith said he was expressing his personal views, but did not let them affect his political actions there. And let's see what else. In a phone call to Fox and Friends, Trump played up initial revelations to claim that they were spying on his campaign. In other critical respects, the draft inspector's report is said not to collaborate with conspiracy theories or other insinuations offered by Trump. There, he's appointed and he took it on. This is a dicey political situation from the very beginning, and none of the evidence used to open the investigation came from the CIA, the notorious dossier. That was a former British spy named Christopher Steele, the Steele Report. Anyway, one of the things out there, Republicans have criticized the use of political opposition research in applications for the foreign intelligence surveillance wiretap. But people briefed on the draft said Horowitz does not criticize them for the basic fact that they used the information. No doubt. Well, Steele had been a spy, so, again, but for the British people, what remains unclear is what the Inspector General's conclusion about Steele's contact with Bruce Orr, a Justice Department official, or an expert on Russian organized crime, himself a frequent target of. Spoke with Steele several times after the FBI terminated its relationship with him, or if briefed the Bureau about those conversations. His wife also worked for the opposition research firm that hired Steele. So kind of a long situation here, and I think we're running over time. I'll quit. We'll save Jamel Bowie and his racism right before our eyes. And is there an impact? Jamel Bowie used to be at Slate. Now, I'll just start this out. Most of our public discourse about racism, when it's not about violence or moments or presidential rhetoric, is about European privilege, implicit bias, and structural racism. Instead of specific actors, we tend to focus on the forces that would actually impede anyone in particular. These forces are real, and those conversations are real. Racial inequality is about the structure of our society, but it's also about more about the origin of bias and discrimination. Let me see if I can get this in here. They're still racist individuals, and they still act in racist ways, and in the aggregate, these actions are still work to disadvantage entire groups on the basis of race. It's not as visible as it once was, no doubt about that, but it is real and still weighs on the lives and livelihoods of millions of people. A potent example of this from a deep new investigation of housing discrimination, working with outside expert in Newsday, that is on Long Island, the leading newspaper on Long Island, conducted a 3-year investigation of racism in the housing market, sending pairs of undercover testers, both Africans and Europeans, and Latinos, Asians, etc., in sequence to realtors throughout the area. The testers reported racial disparate treatment in 40% of the interactions with realtors. African American testers experienced disparate treatment in 49% of the cases. Latinos in 39% and Asians in 19%. Some realtors refused to show listings or conduct housing tours to minority testers. Others steered them away from predominantly European neighborhoods. They warned European testers to stay away from African American or Latino neighborhoods, while also showing more listings and allowing them to see homes without a proof of mortgage-ready financing. This is one investigation in one part of the U.S. Similar studies were in 2012 conducted by the Urban Institute and Department of Housing and Urban Development showed nationwide patterns of discrimination after conducting 8,000 tests in that particular situation, sampling 28 metro areas. So this is a real-world situation. Large and persistent racial gaps in housing and employment are a fact of American life. African-American unemployment rate is still constantly higher than European rates. Africans are disproportionately concentrated in low-wage, low advancement positions. African-Americans are still more likely than any group to live in a neighborhood of concentrated poverty and disadvantage. It's difficult, in some cases impossible, to reproduce in European communities the structural circumstances under which many African Americans lived, as sociologist William Julius Wilson. A good deal of this is the long overhung past discrimination, legacy of Jim Crow, redlining, urban renewal, deliberate neglect of communities of color by authorities at all levels of government. But despite what we might believe about modern American society, some of it is a result of ongoing explicit discrimination. Many Americans are taking deliberate actions to deny jobs and homes based on race. And I've seen that a recent study here of black and European job seekers receive job leads from social media at similar rates. Their use of networks at similar rates too, but David Padula and Devin Page, who died last year, showed African American job seekers are less likely than Europeans to know someone at the company to which to submit applications to which most people are hired. This is an unfortunate happenstance, I guess, but more likely it reflects past discrimination and how it continues to shape the labor market. And this is one of the things economists used to look at and need more to look at, and on our Numbers Man presentation we'll bring some of this in. The solutions, you can expand state and federal anti-discrimination agencies, as well as full enforcement of the Fair Housing Act for starts. And what the Trump administration has done is de-emphasize this enforcement. It lives focused on the American life, that work in tandem with structural racism to replicate past injustices and reduce a racial disadvantage, a 1-2 punch that ensures its future. Recapitulate. I didn't say replicate. Well, anyway, yes, very important situation right there. The NAACP, in closing out our report here, the NAACP has always done this, had a legal strategy, particularly in how African Americans and other people of color are treated in housing, in jobs, in entrepreneurial activities. In other words, the ability, as the Amazon people are saying now, they were discriminated against. It was a bias there by DJ Trump, and thus Microsoft got contract. Being in the IT business over 30 years, we know about this. There's always that situation there. This implicit bias is there. We've called out Google, Facebook, Intel, many of them over the year, Microsoft itself. Some are doing better. Some are not as mainstream. But you get into the corporate thing, and Senator Booker could testify to this. His parents, both historic African universities, went to work for IBM, and thus they moved to suburban New Jersey and were able to rear him in a middle-class situation. Of course, he went off to Stanford, and they say the rest was history. He was a Rhodes Scholar, returned to Newark. But once again, these ecosystems can be there, and Senator Booker's parents did their job. But one of the big problems is the generation after them that are roughly in their 70s now, 10 years older than I am. In places like Chicago, they didn't keep the ball running as they should have. They moved more to individual accomplishment and not collective accomplishment. Thus, many of the institutions that were around in many, many years before Harold Washington was elected, campaign we worked in, are not around anymore. In fact, there was a lottery for canvas, marijuana retail shops or whatever, and there was no African American in the lottery thing. Now, African Americans always like to do lotteries and lottery balls. They were not there, and appreciative of Emma Young, the ad lead out of Chicago, for posting that. But those are some of the concrete things that people of color communities have to do. They have to do sustainable development. That also goes for working class communities. What happens, as the late Kwame Ture used to talk about, starting out with his All African People's Revolutionary Party, yes, it was nationalistic. But the greatest struggle is the class struggle. So no matter what kind of nationalist you are, particularly a nationalist people of color, you have to go to the class struggle. And that's where Bernie Sanders is right now, where you're dealing with everyone, and Elizabeth Warren, to deal with the economic situation, and also you have to level the playing field. And you do this through laws. Nonetheless, have a good weekend, everyone. Happy holidays coming up here. We'll have the Monday morning quarterback as it stands right now. And we'll have a special program, which I pretty much finished up, for Thanksgiving. We'll get those out. It probably will be out on Sunday, and hopefully we'll be able to do a numbers man. We didn't do our medical procedure today, but it's coming up very, very quickly here. Good day. This is Boston Red in the Jerry Pippin broadcast booth on the 23rd of November 2019.